The screens died first. Not gradually, with warnings and flickers, but instantaneously, a synchronized death that plunged the world into an unfamiliar darkness. Cassian Reeves stood in the middle of Times Square when it happened, his phone dead in his hand, the massive digital billboards above him blank and lifeless. Around him, thousands of people stopped mid-stride, staring at their devices like mourners at a funeral. Then came the screaming. It started 3 blocks north, a sound that sliced through the confused murmurs of the crowd like a blade. Cassian turned toward the noise, his journalist instincts overriding his confusion. He'd covered wars, natural disasters, economic collapses, but he'd never heard terror quite like this. It was primal, contagious, and it was getting closer. "What's happening?" a woman beside him asked, clutching a baby carrier to her chest. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for answers he didn't have. Before Cassian could respond, the crowd surged backward like a retreating wave. Through the mass of bodies, he caught his first glimpse of them. They moved with an unsettling combination of awkwardness and relentless purpose, their bodies jerking forward in stuttering motions. But it was their eyes that froze the blood in his veins, milky white, void of recognition, empty of everything that made someone human. The infection had been on the news for 3 days. A mysterious virus spreading through major cities, causing violent psychosis and physiological changes that scientists struggle to explain. The media had called it many things: a bioterrorism attack, a new strain of rabies, a government experiment gone wrong. Cassian had been assigned to cover it, to find the human story behind the headlines. He'd thought he had time. They all had. "Run!" someone shouted, and the orderly confusion became pure chaos. Cassian grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the nearest building, a department store with its doors standing open, emergency locks disabled by whatever had killed the power grid. Inside, the darkness was absolute except for the gray light filtering through the windows. Other survivors poured in behind them, their footsteps echoing off marble floors. "We need to secure the entrance," a calm voice cut through the panic. Cassian turned to see a woman in delivery uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was already pushing a display case toward the door. "Help me, or those things will be in here within minutes." Her name was Marlo Chen, and she moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems without manuals or customer service lines. Cassian joined her, along with several others, and together they barricaded the entrance with furniture, mannequins, and anything heavy enough to buy them time. Outside, the screams intensified. Through the glass, Cassian watched the infected tear through the crowd with savage efficiency. Each person they caught would twitch, convulse, and within minutes rise again with those same dead eyes. The transformation was impossibly fast, a nightmare operating on a compressed timeline. "The elevators are dead," a security guard announced, returning from deeper in the store. His nameplate read "Thorn," and his hands shook as he spoke. "Stairs are the only way up. We should get to higher ground." "No," Marlo countered, her voice steady despite the horror pressing against the windows. "Higher ground is a trap without power. We need an exit strategy, not a tomb." Cassian found himself studying her, this stranger who seemed immune to the paralysis gripping everyone else. While others clutched their dead phones or stood frozen in shock, Marlo was already adapting to a world without the technology they'd all taken for granted. "She's right," Cassian said, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated through years of field reporting. "We need to think like we're in a blackout combined with a mass casualty event. Find emergency supplies, flashlights, first aid, anything useful. Check the sporting goods section for anything that could be used as weapons. A young girl, no older than 8, began to cry. She was alone, separated from her family in the chaos. An elderly man knelt beside her, speaking in soft, soothing tones that reminded Cashin of his grandfather. "What's your name, sweetheart?" the man asked. "Isolde," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm Rigby. We're going to keep you safe, I promise." It was a promise that would become increasingly difficult to keep. Through the windows, the street had transformed into something from a medieval plague vision. The infected moved in growing numbers, drawn by some invisible signal toward concentrations of the living. They didn't tire, didn't stop, didn't exhibit any behavior that suggested anything human remained inside those shells. Marlowe appeared beside Cashin, her arms full of camping lanterns from the outdoor section. "Battery-powered," she said. "Some still have juice. We have maybe an hour of light before it gets too dark to see." "Then we'd better use it wisely," Cashin replied. As the survivors organized themselves in the dying light, none of them knew that the real challenge wouldn't be the infected outside, but maintaining their humanity in a world where every technological crutch had been kicked away. The phones that had connected them to loved ones were paperweights. The GPS that had guided them through cities was useless. The internet that had held humanity's collective knowledge was gone. All they had left was each other, and the question that would haunt them through the coming days: would that be enough? The first night stretched endlessly, measured not in hours but in the moans of the infected circling the building like sharks drawn to blood in water. Cashin sat with his back against a cosmetics counter, a baseball bat from the sporting goods section across his lap, and tried to reconcile the world he'd known that morning with this new, brutal reality. Marlowe had organized the survivors with quiet efficiency. 23 people had made it into the store before they'd sealed the entrance. 23 strangers bound together by circumstance and survival instinct. She'd divided them into watches, inventory teams, and scouts to map their refuge. Without being asked, without voting or discussion, she'd become their de facto leader simply by being the first to act while others were still processing. "You're good at this," Cashin observed during a brief moment when she paused near his position. She shrugged, her expression unreadable in the dim glow of the camping lantern. "I deliver packages for a living. Was supposed to drop off a shipment here when everything went dark. You learn to adapt when half your job is problem-solving around obstacles. What kind of obstacles prepare you for the end of the world?" "All of them, apparently." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone like a candle flame in wind. "My grandfather survived the Cambodian genocide. He always said that soft times make soft people, and soft people don't survive hard times. Guess we're about to find out which kind we are." Across the store, Rigby sat with young Isolde, telling her stories in a low voice. The elderly man had revealed himself as a retired engineer, his mind still sharp despite the tremor in his hands. He'd helped them understand why the power had failed so completely, his explanation painting a grim picture of cascading failures and electromagnetic pulses that had likely been weaponized. "It's not just local," Rigby had explained earlier, his weathered face grave. "For every system to fail simultaneously, cars, phones, the grid itself, we're looking at something that scrambled electronics on a massive scale. Either intentional or the most catastrophic coincidence in human history." "Does it matter which?" Thorne had asked. The security guard had been monitoring the windows, tracking the infected's movements with the vigilance of someone who understood that survival depended on information. "It matters because if it was intentional, someone did this to us on purpose. Released the virus and killed our ability to coordinate a response." Rigby's hands had clenched into fists. "It means this was planned." Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Cashin found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. His mind kept returning to his sister in Boston, his parents in Portland. Were they safe? Infected? Dead? The not knowing was its own special torture, made worse by the silence where once his phone would have connected him to their voices. A soft sound drew his attention, crying, muffled and private. He followed it to the children's section, where he found a woman curled between clothing racks. Her delivery uniform marked her as another worker caught in the chaos. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" It was a stupid question, but she laughed anyway, a broken sound. "My daughter," she managed between sobs. "She's at daycare across town. I was supposed to pick her up at 6. She's only 4. She'll be so scared." Cashin sat beside her, knowing there were no words that could ease that particular agony. "What's your name?" "Narissa." She wiped her eyes roughly. "I keep thinking I should try to get to her. But those things outside. We'll figure something out," Cashin heard himself say, another impossible promise in a night full of them. "Once it's light, we can assess our options." Narissa nodded, but they both knew the truth. The city was overrun. The infected were multiplying with terrifying speed. And without vehicles, without communication, without any of the infrastructure that had allowed modern humanity to function, crossing a few city blocks might as well be crossing an ocean. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful given the circumstances, Marlowe called a meeting. The survivors gathered in the home goods section, sitting on display furniture that would never be purchased, in a store that would never open for business again. "We need to talk about food and water," she began without preamble. "The store has supplies, but with 23 people, it won't last as long as we'd hope. More importantly, we don't know if this is our permanent situation or a temporary crisis." "What are you suggesting?" asked a man named Dalton, who'd identified himself as ex-military. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to following and giving orders, and Cashin could see him struggling with following a civilian woman's lead. "We need information," Marlowe replied. "We need to know if this is happening everywhere, if there are rescue operations, if there are safe zones. And we need to know if staying here is our best option or a death sentence. How do we get information without phones, radio, or internet?" Thorne asked. Marlowe looked at Cashin. "You're a journalist, right? I saw your press badge. You know how to gather information in crisis zones." All eyes turned to him. Cashin felt the weight of their expectation, their desperate hope that someone had answers. "In war zones, you rely on human intelligence. Observation, conversation, pattern recognition. We need scouts, people willing to risk short expeditions to gather information about what's happening beyond these walls." "That's suicide," someone protested. "So is sitting here until the food runs out," Dalton countered, and Cashin saw grudging respect in his eyes. "The supply chain is broken. No trucks are coming. No shipments are being made. Whatever we have is all we get." The grim reality settled over the group like a shroud. Isolde pressed closer to Rigby, her small hand gripping his shirt. The old engineer put an arm around her shoulders, his expression determined despite the fear Cashin could see lurking in his eyes. "I'll scout," Cashin volunteered. "But I'll need someone who knows the area, who can move quietly." "I'll go," Marlowe said immediately. "No," Cashin shook his head. "They need you here. You're the only one keeping this group organized." "Then take me," Thorne offered. "I worked this district for 5 years. I know every alley, every exit, every hidey hole." It was decided, then. When the sun reached its zenith, when the infected seemed least active, Cashin and Thorne would venture out into the transformed city. They left through a delivery entrance, the heavy metal door groaning softly as Thorne eased it open. The alley beyond reeked of garbage and something worse, the sweet, rotting smell of death. Cashin's grip tightened on his baseball bat as his eyes adjusted to the harsh daylight. The city sounded wrong. New York was never quiet, never still, but now an eerie silence hung over everything, broken only by distant moans and the flutter of papers blown by wind through empty streets. Above them, a helicopter sat crashed into the side of a building, its rotors bent at impossible angles. Whatever had killed the electronics had done so indiscriminately. Thorne moved with surprising stealth for a man of his size, keeping to the shadows, signaling stops and starts with hand gestures that Cashin mimicked. They'd agreed to check 3 locations, a police station 2 blocks north, a hospital 4 blocks east, and a National Guard armory that Thorne knew about from his army days. The police station came first. Its windows were shattered, dark stains splattered across the steps leading to the entrance. Inside, they found chaos frozen in time, overturned desks, scattered papers, bullet casings glinting on tile floors. And bodies. So many bodies. "Look," Thorne whispered, pointing to a wall where someone had written in what looked like dried blood, "Quarantine failed. Military pulled out. God help US." Cashin photographed it with a dead camera, then realized the futility of the gesture. Old habits from a world that no longer existed. Instead, he pulled out a notebook, paper and pencil, technology's ancient ancestors, and began documenting everything they saw. They found more messages scrawled throughout the station. Desperate SOS calls with coordinates. Notes from officers to their families. And, crucially, a hand-drawn map showing evacuation zones and safe areas. It was dated 4 days ago, before the electronics died, but it was something. "This shows evacuation centers across the river," Cashin said, studying the map. "If they were established before the blackout, there might still be something there." "Might be," Thorne agreed. "Or might be exactly where the infected gathered, attracted by the concentration of people." They moved on to the hospital, their route taking them through streets that looked like the aftermath of a riot. Cars sat abandoned, some with doors hanging open, keys still in ignitions that would never turn again. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, some showing the violence of the infection spread, others looking almost peaceful, as if they'd simply laid down and given up. The hospital was worse. The infected packed the hallways, drawn perhaps by instinct to a place they associated with healing. Cashin and Thorne didn't venture inside, but they could see through the windows, the shambling figures, the blood-stained walls, the absolute absence of anything resembling medical care or rescue. "There's no one coming," Thorne said quietly, voicing what they'd both realized. "No rescue. No military. No government response. We're on our own." They were heading back, their reconnaissance cutting short by the grim reality they'd uncovered, when they heard it, a child's scream, sharp and terrified, coming from a building ahead. Cashin moved before thinking, running toward the sound despite Thorne's urgent whisper to stop. He rounded a corner and found a boy, perhaps 10 years old, trapped on top of a postal box while 3 infected clawed at him from below. The child's face was streaked with tears, his voice hoarse from screaming. Without hesitation, Cashin swung his bat, connecting with the nearest infected skull with a sickening crack. The thing crumpled, its motor functions severed even as its cloudy eyes continued to track movement. The other 2 turned toward this new threat, and Cashin found himself facing them alone. Time seemed to slow. He could see every detail, the way their jaws hung slack, the dried blood crusted around their mouths, the unnatural angle of their movements. They lunged, and Cashin swung again, his bat catching one across the temple. It fell but didn't stop, crawling forward with broken determination. Then Thorne was there, his own weapon, a fire axe from the station, arcing through the air. The remaining infected went down, and suddenly the street was quiet again except for the boy's ragged breathing. "Come on," Cashin said, reaching up. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The boy, who said his name was Maven, had been hiding since the outbreak began. His parents had told him to stay put, to wait for them to return from work. They never had. For 3 days, he'd survived on cereal and water, too terrified to leave his apartment until hunger and loneliness had driven him into the streets. They brought him back to the department store as the sun began its descent, throwing long shadows across the transformed city. The barricade was open just enough for them to slip through, then quickly resealed. Marlowe met them immediately, her eyes scanning them for injuries before landing on Maven. Her expression softened in a way Cashin hadn't seen before. "Another survivor," she said, and there was hope in her voice, fragile but real. The group gathered to hear their report. Cashin didn't sugarcoat it. The police were gone, the hospitals overrun, no signs of organized rescue or military presence. The evacuation centers might offer hope, but reaching them meant crossing a city full of infected and somehow getting across a river with no working boats or bridges. "So what do we do?" Nerissa asked, and Cashin could hear the desperation in her voice. She was still thinking about her daughter, he knew, still clinging to hope that was becoming more painful with each passing hour. "We survive," Marlowe said firmly. "We adapt. Humans survived for millennia without electricity, without technology. We remember how to be resourceful, how to rely on each other instead of our devices." "And then what?" Dalton challenged. "We live in this store forever? We're not survivors, we're prisoners." "Then we find a better prison," Marlowe shot back. "But we do it smart. We plan. We prepare. We don't just run into the dark and hope for the best." That night, as Cashin took his turn on watch, he found Marlowe sitting by one of the windows, staring out at the infected wandering below. She looked tired, the mask of competence slipping to reveal the fear underneath. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," she replied. "Because the moment I show them I'm scared, they'll realize they should be terrified. And terrified people make fatal mistakes. You are scared, though." "Absolutely." She turned to look at him, and in the lantern light, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I'm terrified. But fear keeps you alive if you channel it right. My grandfather taught me that." Before Cashin could respond, a crash echoed from the back of the store. They both ran toward the sound, weapons ready, and found Rigby on the floor, clutching his chest. Isolde knelt beside him, calling his name in a small, frightened voice. Nerissa, who'd revealed she had EMT training, was already there, checking his pulse. She looked up at them, her face grave. "It's his heart. He needs medication, a hospital, things we don't have." Rigby's eyes found Marlowe's. "Listen," he gasped. "The armory. I know the codes. Old military contacts. You need weapons, real weapons, if you're going to survive." Rigby died before dawn, his heart giving out in a world without defibrillators or emergency rooms or any of the medical miracles that might have saved him. They buried him in the morning in the basement storage area, Isolde crying softly as Nerissa held her, and Cashin felt the weight of another loss in a world that seemed determined to take everything. The old engineer's final words haunted them. The armory could be a game-changer, but it was 6 blocks away through infected heavy streets. Marlowe called a meeting to discuss it, and for the first time, the group fractured along ideological lines. "We can't risk people's lives for weapons," Nerissa argued, her arms still around Isolde. "We should focus on fortifying here, on surviving quietly until help arrives." "Help isn't coming," Dalton said flatly. The scouts confirmed it. "We're on our own, and on our own means we need every advantage we can get. Weapons, ammunition, supplies, that armory could keep us alive. Or getting to it could get us killed," Thorne countered. "I saw the streets. The infected are everywhere." The argument circled, voices rising, fear and frustration bleeding into anger. Cashin watched Marlowe's face as she listened to each person, saw her weighing lives against possibilities, safety against survival. The burden of leadership was written in the tension around her eyes, the way her hands clenched and unclenched. "We take a team," she finally decided. "Small, fast, people who can fight. The rest stay here, keep the store secure." If we're not back in 4 hours, seal the entrances and don't open them for anyone. I'm going, Dalton said immediately. So am I, Cashin added, unsurprised when Marlowe didn't argue. They'd become partners in this new world, bound by shared experiences and the weight of decisions that kept others alive. Thorn volunteered, as did 2 others, a woman named Vesper who'd been a rock climber and moved with feline grace, and a young man called Leaf who'd admitted to a troubled past that included time in juvenile detention. I know how to move quietly when I need to, Leaf had said, and something in his eyes suggested he was seeking redemption in this apocalypse. They left at midday, armed with the best weapons the sporting goods section had offered, baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire, a few hunting knives, and 1 compound bow that Vesper handled with comfortable familiarity. It felt medieval, facing a plague with weapons that would have been at home in the Dark Ages. The streets had changed even in the 24 hours since Cashin and Thorn's first expedition. The infected seemed to be organizing, moving in packs that showed unsettling coordination. Marlowe noted it too, her eyes tracking a group of them as they moved in unison down a cross street. They're adapting, she whispered. Learning. It was a terrifying thought. The infected had been mindless, driven by pure instinct. But if they were developing pack behavior, hunting strategies, the survival equation shifted dramatically. They moved in silence, using hand signals, pressing into doorways whenever infected appeared. Vesper proved invaluable, spotting threats from elevated positions she reached with impossible agility. Leaf moved like a shadow, his troubled past translating into skills that kept them unnoticed. The armory was a nondescript building that Cashin would have walked past without a second glance. Thorn led them to a side entrance, and Marlowe pulled out the codes Rigby had gasped out in his final moments. The keypad was dead, useless without power, but Dalton examined the door and smiled grimly. Electronic lock, but mechanical backup. Standard military protocol for exactly this kind of situation. He pulled out tools from his pack, lockpicks that looked oddly delicate in his scarred hands. Give me 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes stretched like hours. Cashin watched the street, his heart hammering as infected wandered past. One paused near their position, its head tilting as if sensing something amiss. Vesper had an arrow nocked, ready to fire, but the thing moved on, drawn by some sound or smell they couldn't detect. The lock clicked. They slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind them, and found themselves in darkness so complete it was disorienting. Marlowe flicked on one of their precious flashlights, the beam cutting through the black to reveal racks of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Jackpot, Leaf breathed. They worked quickly, filling packs with rifles, handguns, ammunition, and anything else portable and useful. Dalton found flares, Vesper discovered night vision goggles that didn't require power, and Marlowe uncovered something that made her pause: military rations, water purification tablets, and medical supplies. This is more than an armory, she said slowly. This is a bunker. They were preparing for something. Cashin found a filing cabinet and rifled through it, looking for answers. Most documents were standard military inventory, but one folder made his blood run cold. It was labeled Operation Deadfall and contained documents outlining a contingency plan for a combined biological weapon and electromagnetic pulse attack. They knew, he said, his voice hollow. Our own government knew this was possible. Maybe even probable. Did they cause it? Marlowe asked, reading over his shoulder. I don't know. But they definitely planned for it. He tucked the folder into his pack. We need to get this back. People deserve to know. They were preparing to leave when they heard it, voices, human and alive, coming from deeper in the bunker. The team exchanged glances, hands moving to weapons. Survivors could mean allies, but in a world gone mad, they could also mean competition for resources, or worse. Marlowe made the decision with a nod. They crept forward, following the voices to a reinforced door. Through a small window, they could see a group of people inside, 7 or 8, huddled around lanterns. But something was off. One of them had the pale, waxy skin of the infected, yet sat calmly among the others. "What the hell?" Dalton whispered. Before they could process what they were seeing, the door burst open. The people inside had known they were there, had been waiting. They poured out, not infected, not entirely, but not fully human either. Their movements were too fast, too coordinated, and their eyes held an intelligence that the infected lacked, but also something predatory and cold. "Run!" Marlowe shouted. They fled through the armory, pursued by these hybrid horrors. Vesper fired arrows as she ran, each one finding its mark but barely slowing their pursuers. Leaf threw a rack of weapons behind them, creating obstacles, buying seconds. They burst out into daylight and found themselves surrounded. The infected had been drawn by the noise, forming a circle of dead-eyed faces and grasping hands. Behind them, the hybrids emerged from the armory. They were trapped. Cashin's mind raced through options, all of them ending in death or worse. Then Marlowe did something unexpected. She pulled out a flare, struck it, and threw it as far as she could in the opposite direction. The bright light and smoke drew the infected like moths, their attention shifting instantly. "Move," she hissed, and they ran through the gap she'd created, leaving the hybrids and infected to converge on each other in a chaos that bought them precious escape time. They made it back to the department store with all 5 members of the expedition team alive, though Leaf had suffered a nasty gash on his arm from a piece of twisted metal they'd climbed through during their escape. Nerissa cleaned and bandaged it while the others unloaded their haul, spreading weapons and supplies across the floor like pirates dividing plunder. But the mood was grim. Cashin shared what they'd seen, the hybrids, the government documents, the evidence that this catastrophe might not have been an accident. The survivors gathered around, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, anger, and betrayal. "So we were lab rats," Thorne said bitterly. "They unleashed this on us on purpose." "We don't know that for certain," Marlowe cautioned. "The documents showed they'd planned for this scenario. That doesn't mean they caused it." "Does it matter?" Vesper asked. She sat cleaning her arrows with methodical precision, her hands steady despite what they'd been through. "Whether they caused it or just let it happen, the result is the same. We're abandoned." Isolde, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up in her small voice. "Where are my parents? If the government knew, why didn't they protect us?" No one had an answer that would comfort an 8-year-old orphan. Cashin saw Nerissa pull the girl close, but there was pain in the EMT's eyes, probably thinking of her own daughter somewhere across an impassable city. The group spent the evening distributing weapons and learning how to use them. Dalton, with his military background, conducted impromptu training sessions. Most of the survivors had never held a gun before, and their fumbling attempts would have been comical in any other context. But this was survival education, and failure meant death. Cashin found himself partnered with Marlowe for shooting practice. They used a basement storage area, aiming at targets drawn on boxes, the sound suppressors they'd found at the armory reducing the gunfire to dull coughs rather than explosive cracks. "You're a natural," he observed as she hit the target center 3 times in a row. "My grandfather again. He believed in being prepared for everything." She lowered the weapon, her expression distant. "He used to tell me stories about the killing fields, about how the educated and soft were the first to die. I always thought he was paranoid, preparing me for a world that would never come again." She laughed without humor. "Guess he was right." That night, as the others slept, Cashin sat with the folder he'd taken from the armory, reading by lantern light. The documents painted a picture of a world on the brink, nations developing biological weapons, electromagnetic pulse technology advancing beyond safeguards, and somewhere in the intersection of those technologies, a perfect storm waiting to happen. One document caught his attention, a memo discussing Phase 2 of an infection that would create adaptive carriers, capable of coordinated hunting and minimal regeneration. The hybrids they'd encountered weren't accidents, they were the evolution of the infection, the next stage. "We need to leave the city," he said suddenly, interrupting the quiet. Marlowe looked up from where she'd been inventorying their food supplies. "What?" "These documents, they suggest the infection evolves. Those things we saw at the armory? They're just the beginning. The longer we stay in a dense population area, the more likely we are to encounter advanced infected." "And go where?" Thorne asked, joining the conversation. "The suburbs? The countryside? We have no vehicles, no way to transport 23 people safely." "There's a marina, 6 blocks south," Vesper offered. She'd been listening from her perch on a display counter. "Sailboats don't need electricity. If we could get there, we could sail upriver, get away from the city." "That's assuming any of us knows how to sail," Dalton pointed out. "I do," Vesper said quietly. "Grew up on the water. I can handle a boat." The plan formed slowly, debated and refined through the night. They would split into 2 groups, a vanguard to secure the marina and prepare boats, and a main group to transport the weaker members and supplies. It was risky, with a dozen ways it could go wrong, but staying put was slow suicide. Nerissa was the loudest objector. "My daughter is out there," she said, her voice cracking. "If we leave the city, I'll never find her." Marlowe took her hands, forcing eye contact. "Nerissa, I'm so sorry, but you know the odds. The daycare is 15 blocks away through the heaviest infected zones. Even if we tried, even if by some miracle she's alive, the risk to everyone else." "Don't." Nerissa pulled away. "Don't tell me about acceptable losses when we're talking about my child." The argument that followed revealed the fault lines in their group. Some sided with Nerissa, arguing they should at least try to mount rescue missions for loved ones. Others, led by Dalton, insisted that sentiment would get them all killed. Cashin watched as the fragile unity they'd built began to crack under the weight of impossible choices. It was Isolde who broke the stalemate. The little girl walked to the center of the room, her face solemn beyond her years. "My parents are dead," she said clearly. "I saw them get infected. I saw what they became. And if they were still alive somehow, still them inside those monsters, they would tell you to save yourselves. They would tell you not to die for people who are already gone." The silence that followed was profound. Tears streamed down Nerissa's face, but she nodded slowly, acceptance and grief warring in her expression. "We leave in the morning," Marlowe announced. "Pack light. Weapons, food, water, medicine. Everything else stays behind." As the group dispersed to prepare, Cashin found himself on the roof, looking out over the transformed city. Fires burned in the distance, their smoke rising like funeral pyres. The infected moved through the streets below in organized groups, their behavior more coordinated than even a day ago. Marlowe joined him, her presence a comfort in the darkness. "Think we'll make it?" she asked. "I think we have to," he replied. "Because the alternative is unacceptable." She leaned against the railing beside him. "I keep thinking about the world we lost. Not the technology, exactly, but what it represented. The illusion that we'd conquered nature, that we were safe from catastrophe. We got soft, reliant on systems we didn't understand. And when those systems failed, we had to remember how to be human," Cashin finished. "How to survive on instinct and community instead of apps and infrastructure. Do you think that's what this is about? Some cosmic lesson in humility? I think it's about a virus and an EMP, probably weaponized by humans against other humans. But if we survive, if we rebuild, maybe we'll remember not to make the same mistakes." Below them, an infected looked up, its dead eyes catching the moonlight. Then it moved on, drawn by whatever internal compass guided its kind. Cashin wondered if there was anything left of the person they'd been, any awareness trapped inside that shambling shell. He hoped not. Being dead was better than being a prisoner in your own corpse. The night passed slowly, marked by the sounds of preparation and whispered conversations. When dawn broke, painting the city in shades of gray and gold, the survivors of the department store stood ready to venture back into the world. 23 had become 22 with Rigby's death. How many would make it to the marina? How many would survive the river voyage to whatever came next? The questions hung unanswered as they unsealed the barricades and stepped out into the morning light. The journey to the marina should have taken 15 minutes in the old world. In this new reality, it consumed 4 hours of nerve-shredding terror and careful navigation. Marlowe led the vanguard, herself, Cashin, Dalton, Vesper, and Leaf, while Thorne guided the main group with the weaker members 15 minutes behind, ready to retreat if the path ahead proved impassable. They encountered the infected in the third block, a group of 12 feeding on something that had once been human. Vesper's arrows took down 3 before they noticed the intruders. The rest charged with terrifying speed, and Cashin found himself firing the rifle Dalton had taught him to use, the weapon bucking against his shoulder with each shot. The infected fell, but not before one of them got close enough for Cashin to see its face, a young woman, probably in her 20s, with a flower tattoo on her neck and eyes that held nothing but hunger. He shot her between those dead eyes and felt something inside himself die alongside her, some last vestige of the civilized man he'd been. "Keep moving," Marlowe urged, her own weapon smoking. They passed through urban canyons that echoed with moans and the shuffle of countless feet. The infected were everywhere, drawn to the city center by some instinct or perhaps the lingering scent of the living. Twice they had to backtrack, finding their path blocked by hordes too large to fight through. Leaf proved his worth, finding alternate routes through buildings and alleys that kept them moving forward. "Misspent youth," he said with a grim smile when Cashin thanked him. "Turns out running from cops is good training for the apocalypse." The marina appeared like a mirage, its docks stretching into the water, boats bobbing gently at their moorings. But it wasn't unoccupied. A group of survivors had fortified the entrance, rough men and women with weapons and the look of people who'd already done terrible things to stay alive. "That's far enough," their leader called out. He was a thick-shouldered man with a scarred face and a shotgun that didn't waver as it pointed at Marlowe. "Marina's ours. Turn around." "We're not looking for trouble," Marlowe said, her voice calm despite the weapons trained on them. "We just need a boat. We have supplies to trade." "We have supplies," the man countered. "What we don't need is more mouths to feed or competition for resources." Cashin could see the calculation in Marlowe's eyes, the assessment of whether they could fight their way through. Behind them, the main group would be approaching, including children and the elderly. A firefight here would be suicide. Then Vesper did something unexpected. She lowered her bow and stepped forward, hands raised. "Cade," she said, her voice uncertain. "Cade Brennan, is that you?" The man with the shotgun stared, then his face transformed with recognition. "Vesper Lane? Christ, I thought you were dead." The tension drained away as Vesper and Cade embraced. They'd worked together on fishing boats, it turned out, before Vesper had moved to rock climbing instruction. The reunion was warm, genuine, and potentially life-saving. Cade's group agreed to share the marina, though the negotiations were tense. They'd been here since the first day, had lost people fighting off infected and less friendly survivors. Their paranoia was earned, their wariness justified. But Vesper vouched for her companions, and that was enough to open the gate. The main group arrived an hour later, exhausted but intact. Cashin watched as 22 survivors stumbled into the relative safety of the fortified marina, their faces showing relief and disbelief in equal measure. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. But survival brought new challenges. The boats were limited, and Cade's group was already using the largest vessels. Vesper assessed what remained, 2 sailboats that could maybe handle 12 people each if they packed in tight, and a few smaller craft that would be suicide to take on open water. "We'll need to make 2 trips," she announced. "Take the most vulnerable first, get them upriver to wherever we're going. Then come back for the rest. Or, Cade suggested, we all go together. Safety in numbers. My people and yours, combined fleet. Marlowe and Cade negotiated through the evening, working out the logistics of merging two groups of survivors with different leaders and different priorities. It was delicate work, requiring compromise and trust that was in short supply. But slowly, a plan emerged. They would sail upriver together, heading for a small town that Cade knew about, far enough from the city to avoid the heaviest infected populations, small enough to potentially secure. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a next step. That night, as they prepared for departure at dawn, Nerissa approached Cashin. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. I need a favor, she said. Anything. If I don't make it, if something happens to me, she pressed a photograph into his hand. A little girl with her mother's eyes smiled up at the camera. Her name was Maya. I need someone to remember her. To remember that she existed, that she was loved. Cashin's throat tightened. You're going to make it. You're going to survive this. Maybe. But if I don't, promise me you'll remember her. I promise. The moment was interrupted by shouting from the perimeter. Everyone grabbed weapons, rushing to the fence that separated the marina from the street beyond. What they saw made Cashin's blood run cold. The infected were massing, hundreds of them, moving with the coordinated purpose they'd been exhibiting. But worse, among them were hybrids, the advanced infected from the armory, clearly leading the horde. And they were organized, using crude tools to break through barricades, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that the normal infected lacked. They followed us, Dalton said, horror in his voice. We led them right here. The attack came in waves. The infected threw themselves at the fences while hybrids directed them, creating pressure points, finding weaknesses. The defenders fired until their hands burned from the heat of their weapons, but for every infected that fell, two more appeared. We need to leave now. Cade shouted. Get to the boats. Chaos erupted as both groups rushed to the docks. People trampled belongings, grabbed children, helped the elderly. Cashin found himself beside Marlowe, both of them providing covering fire as others boarded the vessels. A section of fence collapsed. Infected poured through the gap, their moans rising to a terrible crescendo. Leaf was there, holding the line with Dalton and Thorne, giving others time to escape. Cashin saw the young man go down under a wave of bodies, saw him disappear beneath grasping hands and gnashing teeth. No, he started forward, but Marlowe grabbed his arm. He's gone. We have to move. They ran for the last boat, jumping aboard as Vesper started the engine, a small outboard motor that somehow still worked, probably EMP-shielded or just lucky. The boat pulled away from the dock as infected reached the water's edge, some of them actually following into the river, sinking into the depths rather than stopping their pursuit. Cashin looked back at the marina, now overrun with infected. Flames rose from the buildings where desperate last stands were being fought. He couldn't see Leaf, couldn't see if anyone else had failed to make it aboard. Count off. Marlowe shouted over the engine noise. Everyone call out. The count came back, 18. They'd started with 23 at the department store. Lost Rigby to his heart. Now 4 more were gone, Leaf for certain, and 3 of Cade's people who'd been at the fence when it collapsed. As the boat sailed upriver, leaving the burning city behind, Cashin felt the weight of those losses. Each name, each face, carved into his memory. Leaf, who'd been seeking redemption. Rigby, who'd given them the codes that might have saved them. The unnamed others whose stories he'd never know. The technology had failed, but so had something else, the assumption that survival alone was enough. They were alive, yes, but at what cost? And for how long in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart? The small town of Millbrook sat 40 miles upriver, nestled in hills that looked untouched by the apocalypse. As the boats approached its dock, Cashin allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe here, far from the urban hell they'd escaped, they could find something resembling peace. That hope died quickly. The town was empty, not overrun with infected, but abandoned. Houses stood with doors open, gardens overgrown, cars parked in driveways as if their owners had simply vanished. It was eerie, wrong in a different way than the city's chaos. They found the answer in the town square. A mass grave, hundreds of bodies buried in a hasty trench, a handwritten sign reading, "The sick. May God forgive us." They killed their own infected, Nerissa said, her voice hollow. Before the infection could spread. Or they killed anyone who showed symptoms, Cade countered. Preventive measures. Harsh but effective. Where are the survivors then? Thorne asked. The ones who did the killing? They found evidence of departure, tire tracks leading north, supply caches emptied, fuel tanks drained. The survivors had fled, probably when they realized the infection wasn't limited to their town, that nowhere was safe. The 18 survivors of the river voyage made camp in the town hall, a sturdy brick building they could defend if necessary. But the absence of infected was almost more unnerving than their presence. It felt like waiting for a shoe to drop, for some horror to reveal itself. That night, Marlowe called a meeting. "We need to decide what happens next," she said. "Do we stay here, try to fortify this town? Do we keep moving? We have supplies for maybe 2 weeks if we ration carefully." "We should keep going," Dalton argued. "This place is too exposed, too close to the city. The infected will find their way here eventually." "Where would we go?" Vesper asked. "We can't sail upriver forever." The debate circled, voices rising with frustration and fear. They'd survived so much, but survival without purpose was just prolonged dying. They needed something to hope for, to work toward. Cashin pulled out the folder from the armory, the documents he'd been studying by lantern light each night. "There's a facility," he said, drawing everyone's attention. "Listed in these papers. A government bunker designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. It's 200 miles north, in the mountains." "And you think it's operational?" Cade asked skeptically. "I think it's a possibility. More than we have here. It's also a 200-mile journey through unknown territory, with limited supplies and 18 people, some of them children and elderly," Marlowe pointed out. She wasn't dismissing the idea, Cashin realized, just outlining the challenges. "So we make it a choice," he said. "Anyone who wants to try for the bunker can come. Anyone who wants to stay here or try their own path is free to do so." The vote was surprisingly unanimous. Even knowing the risks, the survivors chose hope over resignation. They would try for the bunker, together. They spent 3 days in Millbrook, gathering supplies from abandoned homes, preparing for the journey ahead. Cashin found himself working alongside Marlowe, their partnership deepening into something that felt like friendship, or maybe the beginning of something more. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked him one evening as they sorted through medicine cabinets for useful drugs. "I think we'll try," he replied. "That's all we can do. Try, survive, remember why it matters." "And why does it matter? In a world this broken, why keep fighting?" Cashin thought of Leif's last stand, of Rigby's final words, of Nerissa's photograph pressed into his hand. Because giving up means they won. The people who did this, who weaponized disease and destroyed our infrastructure, they wanted us to die or become like those things out there. Staying human, staying kind, choosing to help each other instead of becoming monsters, that's how we win. Marlowe smiled, and for a moment, she looked young again, free of the burden of leadership. "You should have been a motivational speaker instead of a journalist. Maybe in the next world." They set out on foot, 18 survivors with packs full of supplies and weapons, following old highway maps that Thorne had found. The journey was grueling, days of walking, nights huddled around fires, constant vigilance against infected and the increasingly dangerous survivors who saw other humans as competition rather than community. They lost Maven in the third week. The boy who'd been rescued from the postal box disappeared one night, lured away by sounds they later realized were hybrids imitating a child's cry. They found his body the next morning, drained and discarded. Isolde cried for hours, having lost the friend who'd understood what it meant to be orphaned by this new world. 2 of Cade's people left in the 4th week, deciding to try their luck in a farmhouse they'd passed rather than continue the journey. Cashin hoped they survived, but doubted it. Nerissa grew quieter each day, the photograph of her daughter worn from constant handling. Cashin worried about her, but she insisted she was fine, that she had to keep moving or she'd fall apart. They encountered other survivors occasionally, some friendly, offering information about safe routes and infected concentrations, others hostile, firing warning shots to keep them at bay. The world had fractured into tribal units, trust a rare commodity. The bunker finally appeared on a gray morning in the 7th week. It was built into a mountainside, massive doors standing open like a mouth waiting to swallow them. Warning signs declared it a military installation, threatening prosecution for trespassing. The irony would have been funny if they weren't exhausted and desperate. Inside, they found lights, actual electric lights, powered by generators that had been EMP shielded. The facility was partially automated, designed to sustain a population of up to 500 people for years. And it was empty, abandoned or never occupied. The survivors explored in wonder, finding dormitories, supply rooms, armories, a medical bay that made Nerissa weep with relief. It was everything they'd hoped for and more, a sanctuary in a world gone mad. But as Cashin explored the command center, he found something that turned his relief to ash. Monitors showed feeds from across the country, automated cameras still recording the apocalypse. He saw cities overrun, hordes of infected moving with coordinated purpose, and scattered groups of survivors fighting hopeless battles. One monitor showed the department store where their journey had begun. It was a charred ruin now, surrounded by infected. Another showed Millbrook, now occupied by a massive horde that must have passed through days after they'd left. "We were lucky," Marlowe said, appearing beside him. "Every step of the way, we were just lucky." "Or maybe we were meant to make it," Cashin suggested. "Maybe someone needs to survive, to remember, to rebuild eventually." She gestured at the screens showing a dying world. "Rebuild for what? There's nothing left out there. We're not survivors, we're the last witnesses to human civilization." Cashin thought about arguing, about offering hope and determination. But looking at the screens, at the evidence of how thoroughly the world had fallen, he found he couldn't. They'd survived, yes. They'd made it to a sanctuary. But 18 people in a bunker designed for 500, surrounded by a world of the dead, was that survival or just a slower death? That night, the survivors gathered in the common room. They'd cleaned up, eaten their first hot meal in weeks, and for a few hours, they'd almost felt human again. Cashin stood to address them, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes. "We made it," he said simply. "Through everything, we made it. We lost people along the way, Rigby, Leaf, Maven, and others whose names we'll remember. They didn't survive, but they made sure we did. So now we have a choice. We can hide in this bunker, safe but static. Or we can use it as a base, go back out there, find other survivors, maybe start rebuilding." "Rebuild what?" someone asked. "The world is gone." "The old world, yes. But we're still here. While we're alive, while we remember what it meant to be human, there's hope." Marlowe stood beside him, her presence a silent endorsement. "Cashin's right. We survived because we worked together, because we chose community over selfishness. That's the foundation of civilization right there. Maybe we can't restore the world that was, but we can build something new." The vote was split, but ultimately, they decided to stay in the bunker for the winter, recover their strength, and in the spring, begin the work of finding other survivors and building connections. Months passed. They established routines, assigned roles, created a functioning microsociety. Cashin started documenting everything: their journey, their losses, the evidence from the armory about how the apocalypse began. Future generations deserved to know the truth. Nerissa threw herself into organizing the medical bay, her grief channeled into preparation for helping others. Isolde began to smile again, her resilience a reminder that even in darkness, children could find light. Marlowe and Cashin grew closer, their partnership evolving into something deeper. In a world stripped of everything else, they found comfort in each other's presence, in shared understanding of what they'd survived. One evening, 6 months after reaching the bunker, Cashin stood at the entrance, looking out at the world beyond. Snow covered the mountains, pristine and beautiful. Somewhere out there, the infected still wandered. Somewhere, other survivors were fighting their own battles. Marlowe joined him, her hand finding his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That we lost everything," he said. "Our technology, our infrastructure, our certainty about humanity's place in the world. But we found something too. We remembered how to survive on our own strength, how to value each other instead of our devices. You think that makes it worth it?" "No. Nothing makes it worth the cost. But maybe, eventually, we can build something better from the ashes."